Hey, it's Steve. In this video, we're going to take a look at how I finished building this 1x6 foot HO scale switching layout. Let's take a look. Okay, so here is a quick overview of how my 1x6 foot HO scale switching layout ended up. It has been about 10 months since I actually worked on this layout, but with other projects now completed, it was time to wrap up this layout as well before I started on a new batch of projects. First off, I needed to cut out some openings for battery holders and a toggle switch to power and control the structure lighting on the layout. I decided to make the lighting battery powered since I can already operate the layout with a battery powered throttle unit, and so that would make it easier to take the display to train shows if I decide to do that eventually. I drilled holes in the corners of the openings that I needed to make for the battery holders, and then used a spade bit to drill a hole for the toggle switch. I used my coping saw to cut out the opening for the battery holders, though a jigsaw would have been a little bit faster. I test fit the battery holder, then glued it in place with some hot glue. This way, if I had to remove it eventually, it would be a little bit easier to do that. I attached the toggle switch to a leftover cover from a project box and then hot glued that in place as well. With the lights wired up, I wanted to move on to some scenery work. While the scenery was actually already done, I didn't really like how it looked, and plus the large trees got in the way of operations. So I removed the largest of the trees and then scraped off some of the existing scenery. I decided to use a static grass mat that I cut to size for the front of the layout, and that worked really well. I could have just easily used my static grass applicator and applied static grass like normal, but since I hadn't used one of these static grass mats before, I decided to try that out. I applied some additional pieces of shrub material that I had saved over from the original scenery, and then glued everything in place with my usual diluted matte medium mix. Next, since I wanted to build a layout in a shadow box, I needed to remove the existing backdrop. I was worried the structures would be damaged by removing the backdrop, but the backdrop came off really easily without any issues. I built the shadow box out of 1/2-inch birch plywood, and I ripped the plywood down into approximately a 14-inch width to match the width of the layout, and then test fit the end pieces. I had to splice together a few pieces of plywood for the top since I didn't have a single piece long enough for the entire 6.5-foot stretch of the layout. I test fit that and then sanded everything down with my orbital sander, patched the seams, and when that was dry and sanded again, I painted the inside of all 3 pieces with white paint to serve as a primer. I glued and nailed the sides to the top of the shadow box unit and then glued and nailed on a 1x2-inch piece of clear pine to the top front area to add additional rigidity to the long span of the plywood. I test fit the shadow box on the layout once again and then took a piece of 1/4-inch MDF and propped it up against the back of the layout. I used a pen to trace out where I needed to cut the MDF to fit snugly against the side and the top. I cut that piece to size and then made a small notch on one end to fit around a raised edge of that side of the layout. I put that piece on the layout and then took my next sheet of MDF and again traced out the area I needed to cut and then cut that piece to size as well. I used my framing square to make sure everything was lined up properly and proceeded to glue on a splice plate on the back along with some strips of 1/2-inch by 2-inch pieces of poplar. Those were just there to provide stiffness to the backdrop and to provide more material for actually attaching the backdrop to the sides of the layout, since that 1/4-inch of MDF doesn't really give you a whole lot to glue or screw to. I also glued on a couple pieces of MDF on the bottom that extended down a few inches below the backdrop so I could attach that to the back of the layout base as well. Next, I glued the backdrop in place using clamps to hold everything securely while the glue dried. While the dogs checked out my progress, I used some patching plaster to fill in the gaps and seams. I later came back and used some painter's caulk along the joint between the backdrop and top as well. I wanted a very pale blue backdrop color, so I mixed up some leftover white paint cans that I had into one can, and then added a dollop of dark blue paint and mixed everything up thoroughly. I painted the entire interior of the shadow box with the light blue paint mixture, let that dry, and then added a second coat. I also wanted some trees on the backdrop between 2 of the structures on the left-hand side of the layout. So I cut a piece of chipboard to fit the opening and then glued on pieces of super tree material, also called seafoam, to that piece of chipboard. That was then spray painted with camouflage brown spray paint, and then when that was dry, it was soaked with diluted matte medium. A couple layers of green ground foam were then added along with additional coats of the glue mix. While that dried, I worked on adding the lighting to the top of the shadow box. I used 2 stick-on LED strip lights that I picked up from Home Depot for about $10 each. These are USB powered and can be powered for hours using a small battery bank when the layout is traveling, or I can plug them into my outlet using a USB adapter when the layout is above my workbench. I also added a little hot glue in places to help make sure the light strips wouldn't eventually fall down, some months or years down the road. The color changing LED strips do have a slight bluish cast to them when they're in their white light mode, which does kind of enhance the blue color of the backdrop, but I might eventually add another strip of warm white LED lights to the top as well. With the painting done and the lights installed, I screwed the shadow box to the sides of the layout as well as the back, and then glued on the tree background in place between those 2 structures on the left-hand side of the layout. I did have to touch up the backdrop paint in a few spots where I had gotten some glue on it, or where I had just scraped up the blue paint a little bit when trying to attach the backdrop to the layout. I glued and nailed a couple more pieces of 1x2 pine to the left and right side of the shadow box to complete that, and then put the layout up on blocks like an old car. I painted the exterior of the layout with black paint, including the original front fascia, and then after a second coat of paint, I put on a couple coats of my usual mix of matte and gloss medium to help protect the paint finish. To help hide the left side of the layout, I made several more trees using super tree armatures. I sprayed the plant material with camouflage brown spray paint, and when that was dry, I sprayed them down with diluted matte medium and covered them with a couple shades of ground foam and scale leaves. I poked holes in the scenery on the left side of the layout and then glued those trees in place to hide the end of the track on that side of the layout. These trees really improve the appearance of that end of the layout and make it look like the track continues off the side of the layout. With the layout basically done, I test fit it on the shelf above my work desk. I did have to take it back down though to remove a few screws that were in the way and then put it back up on the shelf. I temporarily held it in place with a clamp and then came back and added a few screws to keep it from falling off the shelf. Lastly, I made a cover for the front of the layout using a few black garbage bags. I taped them together with some packing tape, both front and back, and then wrapped the bottom of the bags around a strip of poplar board that I had and taped that in place as well. The board really just is there to add weight to help hold the plastic down against the front of the layout. I taped the top of the plastic to the top of the layout using some more packing tape and then tested rolling the plastic up and down to see how it would work. I'll eventually probably use something nicer than just these black garbage bags, but for now it works well and looks pretty decent. Finally, I numbered my car card slots once again, put my car cards back in place, and everything was ready for operations once again. And so that pretty much wraps up the 1x6 foot HO scale switching layout. The layout was originally built to fit into some bookshelves in my office, but the office was redone and kind of reorganized, and so that layout wouldn't fit anymore in the office. The new version of the layout in the shadow box looks better, I think, overall, and offers some needed protection to the layout. The design allows me to keep dust off the layout and helps prevent things from falling onto it from the shelf above. The LED light strips allow for night mode operation, which is fun as well, and does really add a lot more to the overall aesthetics of the layout. The simplified scenery at the front of the layout makes operations easier as well, since I don't have to worry about bumping my hand into one of the trees. The takeaway here is to not be afraid to redo sections of your layout if you don't like them, or they're not working out as well as you originally thought. And here is a quick look at a great forklift kit I actually just built for the layout as well using a Walthers kit. The kit hardly needs any glue at all since almost all the parts just snap together. After assembling the kit, I just painted the whole thing with Neolube, and it made it look a lot more realistic with just a minute or so of work without any painting or other weathering techniques at all. So now here's a look at how the layout is positioned above my work desk in the garage. And while it's there, I'll typically often operate it for 5 or 10 minutes here or there while I'm waiting for some glue to dry or paint to dry on a project I have at the desk. And so having that layout in the garage is actually something I really enjoy now, and actually allows me to use it quite a bit, since a lot of times I do have that little bit of downtime here and there waiting for something to dry while I'm working on a project there in the garage. And there is a link above and in the description below on how I actually operate the layout using the picture cards. It's a very simple operation method which I really enjoy using, and so something that you might want to check out. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the completion of the Tulsa Spur layout project. I'll actually have a compilation video showing the complete construction of the layout from start to finish coming up here in a few weeks, and then I'll be starting up on a few more project layouts. So I'll have videos of those as well coming up this winter and spring, so be on the lookout for those new projects coming up here in the next several months. So anyway, that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.